They arrived, they went up through the Sunda Strait, which separates Sumatra and Java, and they arrived at Tanjung Priok, which is the port for what's now Jakarta, then Batavia. And the place was not quite in ruins, but close to it. There were smoking oil tanks, that sort of thing, air raids when they arrived, and so on and so on. It was very obvious that the war had come literally. They'd arrived on its doorstep, you know. And there was confusion that they couldn't get orders, didn't know what to do. The local Australian officer there had vanished, a bloke called Collins. And there was some confusion for a while, but eventually they got orders to head east across to the other end, the eastern side of Java, to Surabaya. And they found themselves there in what was called a combined striking force, which was I suppose you'd call it a squadron of cruisers and destroyers, Americans, British, Dutch, and this one Australian ship, Perth. And that was just hopeless. It was just a shambles.
Why?
The Dutch didn't know what they were doing. The Dutch hadn't fought a naval fleet engagement for 200 years, which was the Battle of Camperdown, that they were beaten by the British in the late 19th century. Late 18th century.
Late 18th century.
Yeah, the Dutch admiral was a pilot. He was an aviator. He knew nothing about manoeuvring ships at sea. He was incredibly brave. There's no doubt as to his courage. It was further compounded by the communications problems, because he gave his orders in Dutch. They had to be translated into English. They didn't have a common signalling code. They didn't have a common... Ships these days have what they call, tactical and strategic doctrines and so on. They all know what to do basically in any given moment, and a fleet exercises, so each ship and each ship's captain knows what has to happen. That didn't happen. They were like a team of footballers who'd been chosen to play a grand final without ever meeting each other before. That's a pretty close analogy to what it was.
Or speaking the same language.
Yeah. The British and Australian ships could talk to each other perfectly well, to all intents and purposes. They were part of the one navy. They had difficulty communicating sometimes with the Americans, who had different practices and so on, and it was often hopeless with the Dutch. So it was bound to fail.
What happened when they engaged?
They set out from Surabaya. They were told that we are out to look for the Japanese Eastern Invasion Force, which was basically coming down from the Philippines and Saigon and Vietnam. They couldn't find it. They headed back to Surabaya, and then suddenly it was found again, and off they went again. So they're pretty low on fuel to start with. There were cruisers. They formed the guts of the fleet. 2 Dutch cruisers, a British cruiser, HMS Exeter, an American cruiser, USS Houston, which had once been Franklin Roosevelt's presidential yacht, and there was Perth as well. The British and the American cruisers were new and powerful, but they'd been knocked about in the war before. I mean, Houston's after turret, only 2/3 of a gun were operating. The 2 forward turrets, her after turret was out of action, couldn't use that. They didn't have any air reconnaissance and so on. So they headed off, they found the Japanese, and...
Describe the Japanese fleet that they ran into.
Well, it was a huge fleet of transports packed with Japanese soldiers to make an invasion landing on the coast of Java, on the eastern coast of Java. It was guarded by a powerful fleet of cruisers, including heavy cruisers, which were big, powerful ships, much bigger than anything, more powerful than anything the Allies had.
Is that because the Japanese were there to get oil, weren't they, Mike? And so were they there to safeguard that process?
Rape the East Indies. They wanted oil, they wanted rubber, they wanted tin, they wanted whatever they could get, all under this name. That was an early example of spin, I guess. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But they are there basically to plunder the old Dutch colonies, the Spice Islands. So this was a very fast and powerful invasion. Well, the invasion force was plotting troop ships, but it was guarded by a very powerful force, Japanese naval force. The Dutch admiral was incompetent. He didn't bring the ships to engage. The Japanese gunnery was superior. They had better ballistics and so on. And it just went from bad to worse. The battle really turned when the British cruiser Exeter was torpedoed. She limped out of the line and eventually had to be sent back to Surabaya. And one by one, the Japanese picked off the ships. There's a flock of American destroyers there. They launched a torpedo attack, low on fuel, and had to leave. The Dutch admiral led them into a minefield, led them into one of his own minefields, an Allied minefield, and into shallow water, so shallow that he almost led them aground. A British destroyer was sunk by one of the mines there. The Japanese had air reconnaissance. They had small seaplanes. They could fly off their cruisers. And by night, they just lit the Allied presence, the presence of the Allied ships, with a path of flares, making it ridiculously easy for them to be picked off. So by the end, there are only 2 ships left, Perth and the USS Houston. And Heck Waller, hard over Heck they call him, that's the way he drove his ships, always hard over, you know. He was a senior officer, and so they headed back west along the coast of Java towards Tanjung Priok again. Again, not knowing what they should do next, but they got orders to sail and to try and break out of Tanjung Priok and to go back down through that Sunda Strait between Sumatra and Java. And that was on the 28th of February. They picked up a little fuel, not much. They couldn't get any more shells for their guns, so they were very, very low on ammunition, both ships. Houston was a slightly more powerful ship than Perth. He had bigger guns. And they set off on the 28th of February 1942, believing that the coast was clear, that there was no sign of a Japanese invasion fleet. But shortly before midnight, in fact, at 26 minutes past 11 on that night, the 28th, they ran smack bang into yet another Japanese invasion fleet, again guarded by destroyers and cruisers and so on. And that was it. Low on ammunition, surrounded by these swarms of Japanese craft. They fought literally till the ammunition ran out. Their 4-inch shells, which are basically the anti-aircraft defence, they were firing blanks and practice ammunition in the end, and occasionally star shells, which are great for illuminating a battle but will do no damage whatsoever unless they hit you in the face. Waller was on the bridge doing his best to guide the ship through this literally seething mass of Japanese warships. Perth was hit by a torpedo just before midnight, and Waller knew that was about it. His exact words were, "Christ, that's torn it." And in she was still firing, she was still weaving and darting, you know. And in pretty quick succession, she was hit by another 3 torpedoes. And that was the end.
Mike, I'd like you to do a reading from your book, which describes this moment
sure.
beautifully and vividly.
Most of the men who abandoned ship were in the water when the 3rd torpedo struck well aft, again to starboard. Those nearby had the life crushed out of them by the explosive power of 500 kilograms of TNT, and others even a few hundred metres away felt the shock waves like mallets on their chests, their stomachs, their testicles. Each shell that exploded in the water radiated another force to hammer at men struggling in their Mae Wests, clinging to debris or attempting to clamber onto a raft. Still they kept coming. Sam Stenning, he was one of the doctors, one of Perth's 2 doctors, he was a young surgeon lieutenant from Sydney. Sam Stenning was thrown into the air and knocked unconscious by one of the torpedo strikes. He eventually woke to find himself on a raft with a broken nose, dizzy from concussion. Polo Owen, who was one of the supply officers, lieutenant commander, he dived overboard like an Olympic champion, but found that his Mae West would not inflate, so he struggled out of it and stripped naked to make swimming easier. Blood Bancroft, who was a young teenage sailor, pulled off his boots, stripped down to some football shorts and jumped. Ray Parkin jumped too. Ray was, in fact, the ship's action quartermaster. He'd been at the wheel when the ship was in that battle. Bob Collins, another sailor, took the plunge, clinging onto Red Lead, the ship's cat. Frank McGovern, one of the survivors who's still alive, standing by the guardrail on the quarterdeck, kicked off his sandals but hesitated, fearful that he might get sucked into the ship's propellers. And this was happening in the not quite the dark of night, because it was clear and they could see a lot of what was going on. Frank McGovern, that young bloke, I think he was about 19, 20, he actually went under the ship and could see one of the giant bronze propellers still turning and coming towards him, and was convinced he was going to be sucked in and chewed up by it. It actually shot him out, and he came out of the water about 200 metres astern of the ship, which was still underway, still moving slowly. He survived.
353 men died.
Not immediately. A lot of them died instantly, yes, particularly in the engine spaces and transmitting state, all those parts of the ship well below decks. A lot of them were killed by the torpedo hits, yeah. Quite a few of them died of injuries in the water over that night and the next day. The sun rose on them the next day. And Houston was sunk too. Houston was sunk about half an hour later. The last they saw of Perth, she was, they said she steamed out. Actually, she didn't sink, she steamed out. And they could see this glimpse of the red, white and blue Navy ensign lit by the Japanese